It's actually surprising because I did better on this class exam than I did on the master, which I thought they were going to be flipped. I really thought.
I did better on that.
Yeah, I just washed it and dried it.
I was really surprised.
So I'll need to tell you when I'm going to wear it so you don't wear it on the same day.
Yeah. That's all that. So we don't have one before the first time. Like we learned all of
So she'll do that. So now it's all
All right, do I think I have everyone here? Yeah. All right. I got to start at 9:30, and the keeper of the cohort back there said, hey, it's 9:45. And I was like, oh, thanks for the update. My name is Christopher Day. I'm with the Financial Aid Office. Myself and our loan coordinator, Ryan Overling, are probably the two individuals that you will receive the most contact from. My goal this morning is to just kind of remind you of some things and be on hand for any questions that you may have, because this is happening during your break, correct? You don't start class for another, what, 15 minutes? So I'm going to try to get in and out, give you guys a little bit of time, because I heard you're just recovering from a test. Yeah. Okay, so if you need financial assistance for this semester, it's important that you do or soon complete your 2017-2018 FAFSA, because that is the application that your aid is awarded off of for this spring semester. For next year, includes summer of 18, fall of 18, spring of 19, you're going to need to do the 18-19 FAFSA. It's already available. If you have outstanding requirements listed on your blue link on the Student Financial Services tab, it's important that you check on those to make sure that you've turned them in. If you've done them just recently, for instance, a master promissory note, an entrance counseling of some sort, please keep in mind that it takes a couple of business days for that information to come from studentloans.gov, which is the website you would have gone to complete those items, for us to receive that information electronically. So sometimes our system sends you an automated email that says, missing financial aid information. But you think, I just did that. There's a delay. Okay. For those of you not needing financial aid assistance or not wanting to do the FAFSA, make sure that you have made your payment or set up an installment payment arrangements with the Student Accounts Office, because your bill was due the first day of class. Those of you using aid, you're not responsible for that bill because you have enough aid that's going to come in when it disperses on the 22nd. If there's a credit balance that is created as a result of your aid, you'll be issued a refund of excess aid. That will be issued on the 26th. Okay. If you are not using aid and you haven't set up an installment plan, I encourage you to do so sooner rather than later, because here come February 1st, the Student Accounts Office will start issuing late fees. The first late fee that is assigned to you is an automated $100 installment plan fee on top of a $30 late payment fee. So save yourself $130 if you're paying out of pocket, or you're going to pay throughout the semester. Do I have any general questions that I might be able to answer for you? Yes?
When do we need to have our 18-19 FAFSA filled out?
You can do it already. It's already available. Sooner is always best. Keep in mind.
Can we wait till spring break?
You can wait till spring break. Yeah. And that's the thing. We're going to say sooner is always best. Do it when you have time. You guys are going to be bombarded with class and everything like that when you have time. But preferably before you start in summer. Those documents, if you're going to apply for the Graduate Plus loan, won't be available may not be available during spring break. So it's important to keep an eye out for an email specifically to you from our loan coordinator, because he will let you know when the 18-19 Graduate Plus loan application is available. Any other questions?
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Can you repeat that last thing? But the graduate plus will.
The Graduate Plus Diploma application for the 2018-19 won't be available as early as the 18-19 FAFSA. So our loan coordinator will email you when that becomes available.
So, for example, on my behalf, I have loans outstanding from my undergraduate years. Now, those will go into the
Deferment?
deferment. Am I responsible for communicating that, or
No.
does your office communicate?
Our office doesn't communicate it, but the registrar's office at the university communicates your enrollment. They verify that you are enrolled at least half-time and thus eligible for in-school deferment.
And that's automatic to the.
It is automatic.
So we don't do.
You shouldn't have to do that. However, on occasion, your lender will be proactive and reach out to you and say, hey, you can go by the registrar's office and circumvent that automation if that gives you some peace of mind. There's a form that you fill out with the registrar's office. I believe they'll even mail it in. As long as you have your lender's contact information and mailing address. Yes.
When does the money hit our accounts after our tuition gets paid? Is it Monday?
So, the refunds of excess aid are issued on the 26th, which is Friday. It can be anywhere from 1 to 3 business days. The soonest would be Monday. I would probably bet tomorrow. Whatever it is. All right. Well, I'll step out. That way you guys can relax 10 minutes. 9, yeah. But if anybody has any other specific questions, I'll be out there until class starts. I'm gonna leave some business cards here on the desk. If you want to pick one up, or you can just find me on the website or in your Outlook contacts.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Absolutely, my pleasure.
So walk out.
Yes?
That's the Pop-Tart. It's full of gluten, that bag.
It's very sugary.
Yeah, if you just email me your, that you need to vote for.
Is that working? But I probably know shadow to that, but I just had a person with a. So if you just no. So I was trying to figure out what would work. His stuff is good. There's no other way. It's not like yeah, that's what I do know what I was like, I should probably watch like city, whatever.
How does that do?
I'm trying to know what different times though, because I felt like I just was so burnt out. Like I got into that, like I read this a lot. There's a lot of there's a girl I follow on Instagram. She said that.
and she'll like write her notes down on the slide and ask her.
That's what I brought my bar. I was just and I'd be like, okay. And then by the end of the weekend, I was like, okay, obviously, I need to watch more lectures. And he did. And another one, but like, I mean, I so it's hard, but that's why I'm doing it every night. I'm trying to go watch lecture and like write notes and make Quizlets and then study my morning and work out. And then, yeah, I'm trying to do that, but my sleep schedule is like, no. You will sleep. So we'll see how it
Where's
is.
all my notes?
Busy all day.
I know, it's really like weird knowing that.
Oh my gosh.
I'm having a little bit, and they did this, like, I'm just so tired today.
Yeah, it's so hard to make relish to work out. Yeah.
Wait, what?
Yeah,
Oh, really?
I don't know.
Oh, man.
Like yesterday, I wanted to like
It looked just like the video.
and by 10 p.m. last night, I was like falling asleep, and that's how early I would have to get up if I wanted to.
I never want to do that ever.
Like for an open class day.
Pop someone's job after
I don't know if
church.
that's possible. Like if I'm just gonna like run myself to,
Yeah, which you don't.
because I know I'm one of those people. I just function like that. So I'm trying to figure out.
Well, it was a section in my minor class.
Certain nights of the week, and then the other nights.
It was like a whole unit.
Yeah, well, honestly, because I do like.
I wanted to, but didn't do it.
Like, and like, and they have like many.
I can't imagine, that would be so, I
Like,
struggled.
yeah, it's also like on mornings where I wake up later, or like if I keep schedule like 2 days a week, I'll do like arms, legs, and then like abs and back kind of thing. Like,
I've been fighting to not a lot of time.
well, I wish
Sometimes I get a lot
yeah, that's what I was wanting to like, but I'm moving and getting it's better than just sitting all day. Right, yeah. If I ever get related to it, like I'll just do it high
Oh, yeah,
and then do my Quizlets. And that's why I started that, because that's really good.
So normally,
Well,
so when I
instantly
does this,
so, but I'm just trying to figure out how I can do it, because I know I have to get moving. Because before it's like, if I work out twice or 3 times a week, sporadically, it's fine, but sitting so much, it's like, it's hurting. That's why I don't go out there and I don't think I can focus.
Yeah, I can't either.
And being closer to friends.
About what?
It's not something I really want to change.
You can reset it. I have to go to laptop. Oh, I don't know. I didn't do that. They both do that. Wait, did you change that?
I can really see your face.
I know.
Yeah, you look just like my
you can only select pictures.
Yeah.
And things like that, when you select something else,
Yeah.
pictures. So if we do employees, like everything. Because you're also.
So it's getting
So his birthday's Thursday, I was like, so
yeah.
Double
And Clint's gonna be the That's Thursday.
Well, one's not clinical management today and
I'm ready for this. I'm not ready for the double day dissection. I might honestly, I'm just gonna wear the same scrub. I'm gonna bring my nice scrub and wear them all day and then just walk out and sleep after. I mean, because unless we're like songs. But I mean, nothing really bothers me. Like, I told my group yesterday, I was like, it's not disgusting to me, it's more horrifying. Does that make sense? Like, disgusting was like, ew, it's gross, and horrifying was like, oh my god, that's gross. You know what I mean?
What we're talking about this morning is some pathophysiology. We have to teach pathophysiology, it's the accreditation standard. So I give lectures on pathophys throughout the year on most of the courses that we're going to be involved in. In this first course, there are a couple of small things that we want to cover. The first one is inflammation, and the second one is, I'm talking to you again about something, I don't know what it is yet. Those are basic things, and when we get into the heart, we'll talk about fluid dynamics and things like that. So here we go with the first one. The suffix for inflammation is itis, and that's how I catch a little talk to this talk here. So if we look at the objectives for this lecture, there are several objectives that I have listed here on D2L. You can read over those. If we go to the next slide here, we start the talk. Now, inflammation is generally characterized as either acute or chronic. So we'll start with acute inflammation. And then at the end, go over some types of chronic inflammation. Acute inflammation can occur in minutes to days. If you think about a bee sting, that's acute inflammation. It happens instantly over a few minutes. If you think about a sunburn is acute inflammation, but the pain of a sunburn lasts a few days. So those are examples there.
Your dongle wasn't plugged in at all.
My dongle was not plugged in at all. That's, do you know that thing is called a dongle? You guys know that?
No.
Dongle?
Yeah, like the little USB thing that connects your Bluetooth stuff, it's a dongle. And it works when it's plugged into the USB drive.
I'm glad you fixed my dongle. Acute inflammation regardless of the source is characterized, it says there, by exudation of fluid and plasma proteins. If you think of a bee sting or a sunburn, by exudation they mean movement of fluid and proteins and things from the intravascular space to the extravascular space. You have swelling. Anybody who's had a really healthy sunburn, you get puffy. You get a little puffy with a sunburn. Now, the difference between acute and chronic inflammation is that when the offending agent is over, when you finally get out of the sun, or the bee sting venom has degraded, then the acute inflammation phase goes away, versus if the insult continues. Now, keep in mind that the insult could be something like a chronic disease, an inflammatory disease, like arthritis, for example. You're going to have that in a persistent source. You need to get a hold of this dongle up here. Okay. So, if the acute suspender persists, as in the case of arthritis, then you're going to switch from an acute phase to a chronic phase. That's common sense. The cardinal signs of inflammation are listed here, and they've been around for millennia. Rubor is redness. Calor means heat. Dolor is pain. And tumor is swelling. So those are the characteristics, the cardinal characteristics of an inflammatory process. Virchow, a couple of centuries ago, added that loss of function as inflammation. And you can understand that. I mean, if you take a bee sting, loss of function, what is the function of your skin? Is to protect the underlying structures. If you have a bee sting, now you have an opening in that skin that allows an opportunity for infection. So you're not talking about loss of function necessarily like loss of a limb in arthritis. It can be something as simple as a bee sting. So I would say that would be a cardinal characteristic as well. There are two types of inflammatory, not inflammatory process. There are two types of third spacing. Third spacing refers to if it's not in the intravascular space, if it's not in the intracellular space, it's in the extracellular space. That's the third space. So if I tell you that person is third spacing, that means they're swelling because of something in a place where it's not supposed to be. A person with congestive heart failure is going to third space. They're going to pour fluid into their lungs. They're going to pour fluid into their dependent extremities. They get swollen legs. That's third spacing. Renal failure, it's the same thing because of electrolyte disturbances and protein disturbances with the blood. When we talk about the hemodynamics, we'll go over oncotic pressures and hydrostatic forces that keep fluid moving in and out of blood vessels. But renal failure, they always have a problem with fluid management in places where it's not supposed to be. Hypoalbuminemia is the same thing. If you take the protein out of the blood, you're going to have osmotic and hydrostatic issues that are going to wind up. A person who is hypoalbuminic, and the person that comes to mind is a person with cirrhosis. Albumin is the principal protein of the blood. It's made by the liver. If you're an alcoholic and you have cirrhosis, you don't make albumin. Your albumin is low. One of the common features of cirrhosis is ascites. You collect a lot of fluid in your peritoneal cavity. So that's a type of third spacing right there. Now, the fluid that accumulates, it's either a transudate or an exudate, one of the two. And in this graph here, this is something you need to commit to memory. What's the difference between an exudate and a transudate? You're going to be asked that 1,000,000 times this year. Is that fluid that you're seeing in that Good Shepherd patient a transudate or an exudate? And there are differences here. If you look at a transudate, think of it as a filtrate of plasma. It's water-like. It's pale yellow like plasma itself is. It's thin and watery, and if it's thin and watery, that means it has a low specific gravity. Specific gravity of distilled deionized water is 1.00. So transudate is just slightly above that because you have some proteins in there and not much else. The pH is alkaline typically because the pH of plasma is 7.4. And then you take away things like albumin that tend to have charge to them, so it's more alkaline. There's no odor to it. And there's no odor to it because it's not infectious. cell count, it says low, none or few white blood cells and red blood cells. Again, it's not infectious. This is the kind of fluid that you would see in ascites or congestive heart failure or renal failure. The enzyme content is low, bacterial is none, inflammation is not present in terms of a cause for the transudate. It usually has to do with volume, hydrostatic, or osmotic issues. On the other side is an exudate. If you go to the bottom there, an exudate is associated with inflammation, period. So what we're talking about today are exudates. If you go to the top, cloudy, white, yellow, or red, that's because of the presence of pus or blood. Thick and creamy, that's a nice description of pus, as we'll see. Contains tissue fragments. A lot of exudates have necrotic tissue within them, as you'll see today. This is the good stuff. It almost always has an odor, and almost always is a freaking ungodly odor. So there you go. For those of you who smelled a nice big fat abscess, no. The cell count is high in many WBCs, which is pus. RBCs, because as these things grow, they usually have bleeding within them. Because you have cells in there, you have a higher specific gravity and a higher protein content because of the cellular elements. As well as the enzymes, white blood cells have a ton of enzymes within their granules. When these things degrade, they release enzymes into the milieu, and that's why you have high enzyme content. Bacteria may be present because if you go back to this thing right here, transudate versus exudate, infection is going to give you an exudate. The other three will give you a transudate. Now, the bottom bullet point there, inflammatory response is closely linked to repair. There are three kinds of repair you can talk about here. One of them is it may occur through regeneration of tissue. If you look at hepatitis, it's inflammation due to a virus. Hepatitis can destroy a large part of the liver. You can die from hepatitis. Your liver enzymes, meaning enzymes that were within hepatocytes. Because of the invasion of the virus, these hepatocytes break down, releasing their enzymes into the circulation. So when you do liver function testing and test for the presence of these enzymes, understand that they're there because you have cell death. The higher the enzyme levels go, the more cell death you get. The liver, however, is one of the only organs, one of the few, maybe the only organ that can regenerate. So once the hepatitis is over, if the acute hepatitis is over, you can return your liver enzymes back to normal because of one, lack of cell death, and two, because of regeneration of liver tissue. They occur through scarring. The skin, if you think of the skin, if you have an inflammatory process in the skin due to an infection or due to a laceration or something like that, and you have collagen laid down to repair it, understand that collagen is translucent. You can see through it. And it's also poorly vascularized, so repair of certain things will appear white. This occurs not just the skin, but with viscera as well. A myocardial infarction, that dead cardiac tissue, is replaced with scar tissue. You can look at a heart, and section through a heart, and tell where prior myocardial infarctions have occurred because of these white scars. Now, all of these things right here are involved in the acute inflammatory response. So let's go over these mechanisms. So we've got a venule up there, and most of the movement of cells and fluids in inflammatory processes occurs in the venules. The venules are not thick-walled like arteries, so things have a more difficult time getting out of arteries than they do venules, just because of the architecture. The other thing is that the flow of fluid in venules, that's where a large portion of your blood is currently sitting right now, is in these low pressure venules. So because they're low pressure and not swift, like you're going to see in arteries and capillaries, you have time for movement in and out. Remember, if you decrease the diameter of something by half, you're going to change the pressure inside by a factor of 4. So when you go from a capillary bed to a relatively large venule, the pressure inside that venule slows down. The wall is not thick, so things have a chance to move. All right, so the first thing that happens in an inflammatory response, you see it says vasoconstriction. And that is because and I'll go into this later on when we talk about hemodynamics, but the initial response in inflammation or wound repair is vasoconstriction for several purposes. One is it prevents you from bleeding to death. Two is that it piles up the cells that you need to take care of the problem right there at the spot. So if I have the problem here, I'm going to vasoconstrict, and for a brief period, I'm going to pile up all of the different cellular elements, cellular and subcellular elements that are going to be needed to fix the problem. And these other things are the things that you do to fix the problem. Once they're there, you vasodilate. You vasodilate because you want to bring in all of these cellular processes to make the repair. Initial constriction followed by vasodilation. It's the vasodilation, the increase in blood flow into an area, that produces the redness and the heat. And then permeability changes. This is where the vasculature gets leaky. There are processes that go on that causes the endothelium, which is the lining of the venules of all blood vessels, endothelium, E-N-D-O-T-H-E-L-I-U-M, endothelium, that ordinarily is not leaky, like a piece of PVC pipe, and then all of a sudden it's acted upon by chemical mediators that allow it to become leaky. So fluids can move in and out, proteins can move in and out, cells can move in and out. So suddenly what was a solid piece of PVC pipe is now a French drain. It's the leakiness that causes the swelling or the tumor. Okay? Hemoconcentration and stasis is what I was referring to with the vasoconstriction. Adhesion is a process that involves cellular elements. You can see here that there are receptors on leukocytes. Leukocytes are white blood cells. There are 5 types of white blood cells. I'll mention them later on. So leukocytes are white blood cells. The leukocyte that we're going to be talking about mostly today is what's called a segmented neutrophil. You're going to get this more in laboratory medicine, but segmented neutrophil. It has other names, and I think it's on one of the other slides. When I see it, I'll tell you that's the same thing. 60% of your white blood cells are segs. for short, SEGS, S-E-G-S. The segmented neutrophil has a nucleus has a 3 to 5 lobed nucleus. It's segmented. That's where it gets its name. Segmented. If we were to put a red blood cell up here beside it, that's the size of an RBC. So they're bigger than an RBC, red blood cell. And you have about 4,000 of them, SEGs, for every cubic millimeter of blood. So that's 4 to 10,000 for every cubic milliliter of blood. These things fight infection. And they have enzymes in them that are chemoattractants. Of course, they have receptors on their surface here that allow them to bind to the endothelium, as you see up here. When they bind to the endothelium, they're releasing these chemoattractants that bring in other cells to clean up the mess. Immigration is the next thing, or transmigration of cells from one space to another. These guys, if you have an injury to the subcutaneous tissue, for example, an inflammatory process, erysipelas, you know, the guy with the erysipelas face, right? So why was he so puffy and swollen? Because that infection is caused by staph and strep in the skin, in the subcutaneous tissue. These guys get out of the vasculature into the subcutaneous tissue to eat that staph and strep. They immigrate from the intravascular space to the extracellular and extravascular space to eat up the infection and debris. Chemotaxis is, again, as I mentioned, you have chemoattractants that are going to bring other cells into the process here. And these other cells I'll talk about here in a minute. A lot of these chemoattractant, though, chemicals cause pain. And that's the dolor. They activate sensory nerves to cause pain. Aggregation, you can see the aggregation occurring here. Not only of white blood cells, but you see the red blood cells? The red blood cells aggregate into these little stacks. The stacks here, this is called the rouleau phenomenon. When you have stacks of red blood cells, that's called the rouleau phenomenon. And those stacks occur in the presence of inflammation. Because they are stacked up like that, a couple of things happen. One is it slows the blood down. Okay? Yes?
Did the inflammation come before the rouleau, or is it causing the inflammation?
No, the inflammation is causing the rouleau phenomenon.
So it's kind of like a system for now, when it's inflamed, they're going to slow down the blood.
Right, so if there's no inflammation, all of the RBCs are separate people, things, cells. And finally, yes?
On the immigration, is it the part of the leukocyte that goes out and?
Yeah, so like the guy with the puffy face, the erysipelas, that would be immigration. Another example of immigration, it actually can go the other way. You see these cells right here? These are called marginalized WBCs. When you give somebody a shot of epinephrine or something, an adrenaline type medicine, like to treating asthmatics, the albuterol that asthmatics use, that demarginalizes white blood cells so that they essentially immigrate into the vascular space. So if I did a WBC, if I got a white blood cell count on you and your SEGs were 60%, I gave you a shot of epinephrine for this asthma attack you're having, I rechecked it, but now they're 90%. So there's a lot of movement of cells in and out of the circulation, an enormous amount of movement. Okay? Killing and degradation, there are all types of mechanisms contained within these granules of white blood cells. Hydrogen peroxide is the first one, hypochlorite, bleach is the second one, and nitric oxide, not nitrous oxide, like the laughing gas. Nitric oxide is another common chemical used to kill bacteria and foreign invaders. So this is an example here of the process, what's going on. On this side right here, you have a normal histology of the lung. You can see the alveolar spaces here where the air exchange is going to occur. And this inflamed lung over here, and it could be due to trauma or infection or any number of reasons. You have all of these different processes going on that are described here. I'm not going to read over them, but they're described here. The pink things are red blood cells in there. You lose the architecture, the normal architecture of the lung in an inflammatory process. So if you have a pneumonia that's involving most of your lungs, try to get air into your circulation. Try to get oxygen into your circulation with that mess going on, or carbon dioxide out of your circulation. Read over this thing right here. It's just what we talked about on the previous slide. Okay. Now the stimuli, however you say it, for acute inflammation, it can be anything. Most common ones are bacteria. These things frequently, it says receptors up there. I don't know why I put that word up there last year, and I tried last night to figure, why did I put receptors there? And I don't know. So you can erase the word receptors. Bacteria, viri, and fungi, though, are obviously produce an inflammatory response. It may be because of surface receptors and the recognition of non-self is why I have that on there. Tissue damage from any number of reasons. Foreign bodies is FB. Splinters, sutures. If you suture somebody up, understand that suture material in the skin is a foreign body. And you're going to react to it, or your patient's going to react to it. When you are suturing up that person's lip or their forehead from that bar fight, or you're suturing up their hand from the bar fight, and they hit them in the mouth, and you suture that tooth fragment in there. That tooth fragment is nasty. It's going to produce an inflammatory response in a few days. If you get some jackwagon who, usually a teenage guy, because of a girl, puts his hand through a window or punches a cinder block wall, the cinder block wall always wins, but lacerates his finger. You get that cinder block stuff in there, or paint chips and stuff like that. These are all foreign bodies that produce an inflammatory reaction. That's why you always want to get an X-ray if it's not a clean cut, like from a metallic object. Dirt is a foreign body that we see all the time. Road rash, because of people riding motorcycles, scooters, bicycles, taking the plunge and getting bits and pieces of gravel and just plain dirt under their skin. Immune reactions, autoimmune disease, there are a whole host of autoimmune diseases that produce inflammatory reactions. I mentioned arthritis is one of them. That would be rheumatoid arthritis. Not osteoarthritis, rheumatoid arthritis. Sjogren's syndrome. Ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease. There are a whole host of inflammatory autoimmune processes that you're going to be dealing with in your career. Allergies to drugs can be mild to deadly. Anaphylaxis is, of course, a inflammatory process gone wild. Stings and then other antigens that you just don't know, like pollen. We're the #1 state in the country for allergies. So,
Really?
allergies, gonococcal pharyngitis, syphilis. We just keep going here. We just keep going. Okay. Any questions about any of that? All right. So if you look at the different cellular elements involved in inflammation, endothelium, because it's either, it can become leaky, and you get, that's a valuable, and it also, endothelium also plays a part in blood clotting and other mechanisms in terms of hemodynamics, and I'll go into it in a later lecture. SEGs, this is the white blood cell that I mentioned, segmented neutrophil. There are lymphocytes mentioned in there. Everybody knows what a lymphocyte is. Anybody not know what a lymphocyte is? Okay, lymphocytes, there are different varieties of lymphocytes. B lymphocytes will produce antibodies. An activated B lymphocyte is a grown-up lymphocyte. Excuse me, a grown-up B lymphocyte is a plasma cell. Plasma cells are activated B lymphocytes that just sit there and pump out antibodies directed against something. That B antigen or the cold virus or whatever. You have B lymphocytes in your circulation. When they are called upon, they transform, they leave the circulation and become plasma cells in the subcutaneous tissue. Plasma cells are not in the circulation normally. We'll go into what plasma cells do here in just a second. TH lymphocytes here. This is, there are two primary types of lymphocytes, B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes. TH is a T helper lymphocyte. A T helper lymphocyte is also has a cell surface marker on it. It's called CD4. CD4 positive T lymphocyte. So the designation is CD4. That's a T lymphocyte. That T lymphocyte, the reason it's called a helper T lymphocyte is because when activated, it induces B lymphocytes to become plasma cells to produce the antibodies. Without T helper cells, the B lymphocytes you just don't mount an effective antibody response. Everybody clear on that? And so to put that in very simplistic terms, HIV kills CD4 positive T lymphocytes. Because they have a low CD4 count, that's when they have a lower immune response and opportunistic infections occur. Not just infections, but Kaposi's sarcoma is also related to that, which is common in AIDS patients. Okay, so it's related. The TNK cells are natural killer cells. These are CD8 positive. These cells, when activated, produce a protein called perforin. Perforin actually is a protein that's like a toilet paper tube that gets inserted into the membrane of cells and causes them to become leaky. So like the bacteria, or let's say you get a transplanted kidney, that's non-self. You recognize it as non-self. The CD8 cells go attack it and start putting perforin into the new kidney, and you lose your new kidney. So that's the difference between cell-mediated immunity and humoral immunity. You remember that from undergraduate days? Humoral immunity versus cell-mediated. They all play a role here in inflammation. Platelets do, because platelets are full of substances that cause changes in the vasculature. Changes for them to become leaky, or for the blood to clot, and so on. Monocytes are one of the 5 white blood cells. You got a question? Kristen? Kristen, right? Okay. Monocytes are another white blood cell type. Monocytes are immature cells in the circulation. You have maybe 5% of your white blood cells are monocytes. When called upon to do so, they immigrate from the intravascular space into the subcutaneous or extravascular space and become macrophages. Macrophages are little eating factories. They will gobble up debris, bacteria, everything. Garbage. Yeah, they clean up. Okay? There are no macrophages in the circulation. They're monocytes. It's when they leave the circulation that they become macrophages. And one of the things, I'm not sure if I've already missed it on a previous slide, one of the things about acute inflammation that makes it acute and goes away in a matter of days is if you've got proteins outside of the vasculature. Let me say it another way. Proteins within the vasculature usually have some type of carrier protein attached to it. Or enzymes in the vasculature have a carrier protein attached to it that protects it from degradation. But when you get outside the vasculature, you lose that protection. And enzymes and proteins and stuff that are outside the vasculature, they are degraded within a matter of hours to a day or so. Macrophages and segs, they only live a few hours outside of the vasculature. That's why acute inflammation can resolve so fast. That's why pus is full of debris, cellular debris, because these things don't last long outside of the vasculature. It's a nice system. You don't want things outside the vasculature to live for weeks and weeks and weeks. You want it to be over. Okay. Basophils are another type of white blood cell. Oh, excuse me. Eosinophils and basophils. We're going to just take them together. There are 2 more types of white blood cells. They're only like 1% of the circulating white blood cells. They're not very common. But they're full of granules that work in specific areas. And just know that they're part of the inflammatory process, but let's not talk about them today because they're so few in number. I'll just give you an example because I can't stop leaving something hanging like that. If you have a roundworm infection, you know, if you go walk around in southeastern Oklahoma barefoot all summer and step in feces and stuff, I know you do, because people are pooping on the ground and stuff down there. If you get round, the little egg, the larvae go up through your feet, and now you've got a roundworm infection, you'll have a very high eosinophil count. You know, when you get allergies, you know, and you're sitting there sniffing like that, like you're just doing right, like that, but if you look at, you got that little clear drop of snot right there on the tip of your nose. You know what I'm talking about? Everybody knows what I'm talking about, right? If you take that little clear drop of snot, put it on a slide, stain it, it's a sheet of eosinophils. So that type of allergic, inflammatory response, an allergy, there you go with eosinophils, okay? Mast cells are another type of cell that you don't find in the circulation. They're in the tissues. And they're in tissues where there's an opening. They're in the subcutaneous tissue where there's an opening to the environment. Like around your nose, around your mouth, around your eyes, your ears, your hiney, places like that. They have granules in them that once you release mast cells, it produces an inflammatory response. I'll give you an example there. There's a drug that you're going to prescribe. It's called a mast cell stabilizer. What it does is it prevents mast cells from degranulating or releasing their granules. It's those granules that produce an asthma attack. So that's one of the treatments for asthma is a mast cell stabilizer. We talked about plasma cells. They're nothing but immunoglobulin factories. And fibroblasts, we know, produce collagen and elastin fibers and are critical for repair. Now the next couple of slides here, this one right here, well, let's go over some chemical mediators. Histamine and heparin are located in mast cells. So what histamine and heparin do, if you go to the next two slides, this presents the information in different ways. Histamine and heparin participate a lot in vasodilation. So you can compare this chart right here with this one and the next one. They just summarize the information different ways. However, it's easier for you to learn it, that's fine. And what you need to learn is the general role of these agents. You don't need to learn, that TNF does all of these things right here. Generally, what does TNF do? Okay? Vasodilation, chemotaxis, just generally, what do they do? Okay? So let's go back up here. Serotonin is present in platelets. When serotonin is released into the circulation, just like on this slide here, serotonin also vasodilates. For those of you that take Maxalt or Imitrex or something like that for headache, what does it do? It blocks serotonin. Hence, vasoconstriction, headache goes away. Okay? Cytokines, there are all sorts of different cytokines. Interleukins, there's some interleukins that we'll talk about here in just a second, that produce fever. The release of interleukins, especially IL-1 and IL-6, produce fever. TNF is tumor necrosis factor. This is a chemical that is released by these inflammatory cells to produce inflammation. Some of the drug, and let me give you an example of where we can take advantage of that. Some inflammatory processes, like Crohn's disease or arthritis, you see the commercials on TV for Remicade or Enbrel or all of these drugs to treat Crohn's, arthritis, and so on. The reason they're marketing these drugs is because they're called biologics. One of them is an